The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can hear it, see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the very first day of this November sesshin here at Mountain Gate, a 7-day sesshin, and I'd like to speak a little bit about koans and also about the history of Zen. In ancient times, when meditation was practiced, and Zen is about meditation, life was so much more simple than it is now. And people were able to come to awakening, deep awakening, relatively easily and simply. Awakening, of course, has no words. There's no way to describe it. It's the finger pointing at the moon, and the moon is our true nature, or there are so many other words to call it. It's the source of every religion's practice, really, and different religions have different names for it. In Zen, we call it our true nature. But as time went on, things got more complicated. And initially, while teachers had 1 or 2 students and were able to interact personally with each one of these students, offering personal attention and personal guidance to each one of them. As things grew, monasteries began to attract many, many people. And in fact, the older Chinese monasteries had literally thousands of monks and, curiously enough, vassal servants, slaves, who farmed for them and also provided for the temple. Of course, there were also lay people who were free and simply wanted to support the monks or the nuns that were in a given temple. It was quite regimented, but with thousands of monks, a teacher, no matter how great a master that person was simply unable to give each student personal attention. And this is one of the benefits we have here at Mountain Gate. We do not have an enormous sangha, although our lives are considerably more complicated than centuries ago. We have the benefit of individual practice, individual guidance, which is a rare gift. So things continued along, and eventually, well, let's back up a minute. Originally, it went from personal, individual training, where a person, there were so few monks or so few people at a given master's temple that that person was able to give personalized training to each one of them. As it grew, the master began to do talks, and they were always talks pointing at our true nature. This is one of the characteristics of the Zen school. It does not give words except in ways to trigger enlightenment. It doesn't study sutras. It doesn't describe the true nature. There's very little possibility, in fact, there's no possibility of actually describing to someone how to do the practice. We can describe how to do meditation. We can point people to the benefits of meditation, in particular to the extended out-breath meditation, which is known as Susokkan. But we can't do more than that. Here and there, a pointing word, here and there, a suggestion. But there's no 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 steps and you're home free in Zen. Along the way, because the groups began to get so big, the masters began to use sort of the same words, the same descriptions, and really not descriptions. Well, they were descriptions in a certain way, but they were based in what was happening in the moment. They were not a description of true nature. For example, there is a koan in which a master is asked, what is Buddha? In other words, what is awakened mind? What is our true nature? And this master was weighing out flax at the time, probably to measure enough to weave into some garment to wear at the monastery. And he picks up a batch of flax, a lump of flax, from the scale and says, 3 pounds of flax. It's not the 3 pounds of flax is our true nature. He was demonstrating true nature without any extra embroideries. And this is how koans began to be remembered. Masters coming from their own personalities and teaching through that, and also in tune with their students. There's a poem to one of the koans that says, if you meet a swordsman, give him a sword. If you meet a poet, give him a poem. In other words, you want to relate what your words are, or your actions are, or your expression is, to what the student needs. And this is one of the things about the Zen school, particularly the Rinzai Zen school. Over time, these koans, as they're known, which translates as public cases, were codified and collected into collections. And the collections were commented on, and often editions were made that expressed comments, poems or other comments. The two most well-known collections of koans are the Muon Kan and the Heikigan Roku, the Blue Cliff Record. And those are well translated into English. Then there are other koans, the Shoryuroku, and the Juju Kinkai, the precept koans, the Rinzai Roku koans, the Kato Shu, which is translated as entangling vines and creepers. All of these collections, along with a number of miscellaneous koans, as well as what are known as the breakthrough koans, combine to offer a way to deepen, to come to awakening and to deepen that awakening, both of which are important. Somewhere along the line, although Dogen, who was considered the founder of Soto Zen in Japan, quit using the koans in the traditional manner, the Rinzai sect or school, these are known as Rinzai Shu or Soto Shu in Japanese, continued to teach koans in the ancient ways, really as pointers to deepening awakening. And that's how we use them here. Perhaps one of the earliest koan was when Bodhidharma was sitting facing the wall after he had had an encounter with the Emperor Wu of Liang, who was not ripe enough to understand Bodhidharma's teaching. And it was clear to Bodhidharma that it wasn't going to be fruitful staying in the court there. And so he went off on his own and found a cave above Shaolin Monastery, which, by the way, now is teaching a particular kind of martial arts, but that, although it has been attributed to Bodhidharma, actually did not come into being until centuries after Bodhidharma had lived and died. So Bodhidharma did not teach it, supposedly, and he simply found a cave, which still is extant above the monastery, and did Zazen, ripening his own mind. And in time, a man came named Ekadaishi in Japanese, who had been studying the sutras, which was a major form of Buddhist practice in China in the era, and still is in some sects. And he had found that after decades of studying the sutras, he still was ill at ease, and came to Bodhidharma, somehow found him, and said, my mind is not at ease. Can you please put it to rest? And Bodhidharma said, bring me your mind and I'll put it to rest. And Eka Daishi searched and searched and searched and could not find anything he could call his mind. And this is a very important point in Zen practice. We assume up here in this box is something that is called our mind, and that it causes thinking, it causes understanding, and so on and so forth. But we also assume that that's who we are. While it may be in part somewhat accurate, it's not fully accurate. And who we are is so much more vast than this body. And our ability to understand is so more vast than either hemisphere of our brain can comprehend. So who are we? If we're not this body, if we're not this brain, who are we? How do we know how to live? And all manner of pain and suffering come as a result of lack of recognition of this true nature. I would hazard a guess that every human being who comes to life comes in search of that precious treasure that is already there. We've never been without it. And we often, pretty much most people, try to find that outside of themselves. And all kinds of unpleasant things happen as a result. And not to mention the fact that we keep seeking in various external means for that, what we assume is the pleasure that comes from knowing our true nature. And it's not there. Not in those words, not in those parties, not in those clothes, not in those possessions, not in those relationships. And often the relationships turn sour as a result of that search in the wrong direction. And to add to that fact, the more awake we can become, the more let go we can become of that idea of who we are, the better our relationships, the more harmonious our relationships will become, and the more fulfilling they will be as well. In the opening talk last night, in the opening ceremony, I mentioned that this is not a quick fix. Zen practice requires time for its secrets to unfold, for its openness to become revealed, for its freedom to become realized. It's not something where Roshi Kapleau, when he first went to Japan, said that it was his intention to go to Japan, grab Kensho, and run. Thankfully, he didn't do that. Thankfully, he stayed and deepened that awakening that he did have, and returned to the States after many years, and was able to teach, continuing to grow, continuing to deepen his wisdom, continuing to open more completely to that profound truth that we can realize. It's a long process, but it is an incredibly worthy process, well beyond that. But it does entail a lot of work. It also entails courage, because most people come to Zen practice because they found that what's outside in their lives is not sufficing to provide lasting happiness. This is how I came, and it won't, because we're seeking it outside. But within, there is that incredible, precious beingness that we are, that we can realize, even though it is everywhere and yet nowhere. And there's a koan for you right there. At any rate, back to Bodhidharma. He said, "Bring me your mind and I will set it to rest." And Ekadaishi could not find it, and finally said, I can't find it. And Bodhidharma responded, "There, I've set it to rest." Would that it be so simple? Well, actually, it is simple. It's just we are always looking in the wrong places and trying to find it somewhere else. Koans developed in order to help point the way to awakening, to help trigger awakening, and also to help deepening awakening once it has happened, because it is absolutely vital not to get Kensho and run, but to eventually get Kensho and open and expand it so our realization is deeper, and so that it infuses our life in such a way that our behavior corresponds to what we have realized. And in that way, our innate compassion and wisdom begin to be more completely revealed, and we begin to behave more in line with what we have realized. And this is absolutely vital. Another example of a koan, and this is a breakthrough koan. There are a number of breakthrough koans. These are the koans that students, when they're ready, are assigned one koan, and it depends on the affinity of the student what that koan will be. There are just a small handful of them. The most well-known one is the koan mu, mu meaning no or negative in both Chinese and Japanese, and it has to do with the great Chan master, and Zen is called Chan in Chinese. He was Chinese. Joshu, a monk asked him, "Does even a dog have the Buddha nature?" And of course, that's hard to comprehend that someone would even wonder about that, since we just had a wonderful kinhin a few minutes ago with including a four-legged member of the Sangha. But in those days in China, dogs were considered quite negative creatures, despicable creatures, dirty, and probably they were dirty and mangy because they were wild. And they didn't seem to include the little pet Pekingese dogs that they had later on. But at any rate, this monk is so full of the idea that Buddha nature is something special, and that only the most highly illuminated human beings might be endowed with the Buddha nature. He was asking, does even a dog have the Buddha nature? Because the Buddha himself had said, yes, all beings are endowed with this profound mind of awareness and compassion to which I have just awakened. And Joshu said no, which is half of the truth. So that's kind of a conundrum. If every being, if everything has the Buddha nature, has true nature, how could a dog be left out? So you chew on that for a long, 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 long time. Years. I know someone who worked on that koan for 20 years. In ancient China, people worked on it for a lifetime, continuing to go deeper. Another koan came out of an encounter with the brand new 6th patriarch of Zen at the time, Huineng, who had grown up as an itinerant woodcutter after his father died when he was 3, and his mother was not educated woman. They were living in the backwoods in the remote part of China to which his father had been exiled from some relatively high-level government job. And so Huineng had spent his life helping his mom gather wood to sell for kindling, for firewood, for cooking, and so on. And at one point, when he was 19 years old, he had been delivering a load of wood to a client, and an itinerant pilgrim was walking by chanting the Diamond Sutra. And when Huineng heard the part that said, "Arouse the mind that abides nowhere," he had a sudden and deep awakening. And circumstances gathered around him such that he was able to be given money to support his mother so that he could go to the patriarch's, the 5th patriarch's temple to train further. He never ordained at that temple. Eventually he did ordain, but he worked hulling rice, actually. And that place out back in that temple, there's a hole where the rice was put, and there's a great sort of, I don't know what it's called, but you stood on it, and it had a lever and a hammer, big weight on one end, and all day long he was doing that exercise, standing up, letting go, standing up, letting go, standing up, letting go. And the rice was being pounded, the hulls were being pounded off the rice. It is said that he was small and light, and so he actually had to tie a rock, a big rock around his waist to get enough added weight to actually be able to work that system. But eventually he was sanctioned by the 5th patriarch and became the 6th patriarch. And the 6th patriarch urged him to leave immediately because there were monks who were going to be jealous, and his life would be in danger. And so he took off and went across the river, and because he'd lived in the mountains, it was relatively easy for him to wend his way south, where he had come from. And as soon as they found out that the robe and the bowl, which symbolized the transmission, had gone to the south, as the 5th patriarch put it, they figured out who had it, and they decided he'd stolen it. And they went off in hot pursuit. And one monk, had been a general, supposedly, in his previous life, Monk Myo. Myo means brightness, or can mean brightness or brilliance. And he was the one that was able to track Huineng and catch up with him. And when Huineng realized that somebody was coming, he put the robe and the bowl on a rock and hid behind a bush. And Monk Myo came and tried to lift up the robe and the bowl and couldn't. There's a psychological event going on here. At some level, he didn't 100% believe that Huineng had spirited off the robe and the bowl illegally. And so there was sweat dripping off him. He called out, lay master, I didn't come for the robe and the bowl, I came for the teaching. And so Huineng stepped out and said, let's do some zazen, and I will teach you. And after they had done zazen for a while, and Monk Myo had settled his mind, the Huineng said to him, when you were following me, thinking of neither good nor evil, and this part is critical, thinking of neither good nor evil, just 100% present on that tracking. No ideas about what he was going to find, who he was after, why he was after somebody, just intent on the tracking, just present. When you were following me, thinking neither good nor evil, where then was your original face? Well, we always assume, okay, isn't this our face? But another way of expressing this koan is, what is your face before your parents were born? And how can you have a face before even you're born, much less your parents being born? And at that, Monk Myo came to awakening. Huineng spent another 15 years out in the forest, deepening his practice, deepening his awakening, putting it to use, putting it in action. Before one day he learned of a master who was giving a lecture at a temple nearby and went to listen to the talk. And whenever talks are given at traditional temples, there is a flag hung that indicates that there is going to be a talk. And actually, Rochester Zen Center has adopted that practice as well. And so the flag was out, and the wind seems to have been blowing. And as Huineng approached, there were monks arguing about whether the wind was blowing or whether the flag was moving. Which was it? Was the wind moving the flag, or was the flag moving? And Huineng famously said, it is your venerable minds that are moving. At which point the master of the temple recognized that he was probably the sixth patriarch that was expected to be somewhere in the area, and asked him to give a talk. And for several days he stayed at the temple and did teaching. During that time, he also expressed the first repentance ceremony and spoke of the 4 vows, the bodhisattva vows. A bodhisattva is someone who comes to awakening not for their own personal benefit, but for the benefit of all beings. Because as we let go more and more of our stuff and become more light and more free and more, our innate compassion and wisdom is more readily available, it influences others, seen and unseen. And you've all heard some of the examples of that. For example, with Jacques Lutheran, who was imprisoned in Buchenwald, a notorious concentration camp during the Second World War, run by the Nazis, and finally couldn't take it anymore. He was being starved, as all the prisoners were being starved, but in his case he had even less to eat because desperate prisoners were stealing his food. They got crusts of bread and a little soup. That was it. And they would steal his crusts of bread. It's kind of hard to steal soup. And finally he was dying because of a combination of malnutrition and enormous stress. But he came to awakening through that utter presence that he was able to put to use as he was dying. And he didn't die. Instead, He had such a profound awakening that he changed radically. He found joy, he wrote, and the joy never left him. And from then on, other people quit stealing his food. He didn't have to say anything. He didn't have to do anything. Just his beautiful energy was enough to cause people not to want to do that, even though they were starving. So over the years, koan collections were gathered, and we still, in the Rinzai sect, still use them in the traditional way. In other words, they are considered pointers in a certain way, perhaps triggering enlightenment if we're ripe for it, or at least pointing the direction. And Rinzai, for example, was very famous for shouts as a response to people's questions. There are other ancient masters who had different personalities and responded in different ways. And all of these were collected, and we have the option to begin to work on them once we have passed that breakthrough koan. And the breakthrough koans, as I started to mention, the Mu koan, your face before your parents were born, or your original face. There's a more modern version of that. Who am I? There's a sound of one hand. How can one hand make a sound unless you're slapping on something? This is the one hand simply expressed. How can we simply express it without it making a noise? And it's no fair to try to slap it on something. That doesn't count. That won't get you passed on that koan. In fact, that's the koan that Hakuin favored. He wasn't particularly fond of Mu, nor am I, because it's really hard for modern Westerners to think that a dog would not have true nature. So the puzzlement that is essentially in a koan, the lack of words to explain, which is essential in a koan, is just not there for most Westerners. When I was working on Mu, that was my assigned koan. I was ostensibly working on Mu, and I would make presentations in Doksan to Roshi Kapleau on Mu. However, what I was really working on was the Prajna Paramita, the Heart of Perfect Wisdom, which says, form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. How can this table sitting before me, how can this light sitting next to me, how can the scroll hanging on the wall be empty? And yet, in the most profound, deep way, it is both form and empty. The scroll says in Japanese, out of not one thing arise the 10,000 things. Out of emptiness arise the 10,000 things. At the same time, they are still empty. It's something very difficult to wrap our brains around, or our ideas around, and that's the point. It's about going beyond ideas, going beyond thoughts, going beyond explanations. This is vital in Zen practice. And it is a tool that helps to bring us infinitely deeper. It's a challenge as well, because most of us are used to succeeding in what we take on. We get reasonable grades in school, and we have a reasonable life. We can go to the grocery store and know how to buy things, for example, and so on and so forth. But there is no way to understand a koan unless you go beyond words. And that is its gift. Because to comprehend the awakened mind, to comprehend God, to comprehend Allah, to comprehend our true nature, we have to go beyond words. There is no other way to do it. If we use words, it sets up a barrier between ourselves and the realization and the freedom that comes from that realization. The greatest saints of any religion have come to realize what they realized by going beyond words. And so while it's not something we're accustomed to doing, we're trained 12 or more years in school to use words, to use concepts, to use ideas, and yet none of these are going to work if we're working on a koan, or if we're doing our Zen practice even without a koan. This is why the Susokkan, the extended out-breath, is so vital, because in extending the out-breath, we have to let go thoughts, ideas, assumptions, because you cannot extend it without focusing more and more completely. And within that focus, there grows awareness as well. So this is an incredibly effective practice. It is also quite grounding as well. I think that pretty well covers it. And we're beginning to run to the last few minutes of time this afternoon. But koans are incredibly powerful. They do show us where we're caught because we get frustrated, we get irritated, we feel bad if we can't solve it right away. It hits all of our issues, and yet in doing so, it frees us. And there are more than 1,700 koans, so there's plenty to work on, plenty of opportunity to come to awaken and deepen and become truly free, not for our own sake, but for the sake of all beings. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.